Perfect. Our next talk is Applications for Reflectance Transformation Imaging, RTI, in a Fine Arts Museum, Examination, Documentation, and Beyond, with Philip Klausmeyer. Philip earned an art history and studio art degrees from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and an MS from the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation, specializing in paintings. In addition to 15 years at the Worcester Art Museum, his conservation work includes time at the Strauss Center for Conservation, Harvard Museum of American Art, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He received his PhD from Clark University and is currently a conservation scientist and associate paintings conservator. I'll hand it over to
Thanks, Jason. Okay, so today I'm speaking not in the capacity of a conservation scientist, but to really what I want to do is add my voice to this growing chorus of end users and conservators about the value and use of RTI in our day-to-day practices and its importance in answering defined questions. Thus the title today, Applications of RTI in a Fine Art Museum, Examination, Documentation, and Beyond. Now, a quick overview of my presentation includes an introduction, and then it's divided into two parts. The first part is using RTI to study Greek Attic pottery, and the second part is an application of RTI in an ongoing conservation treatment of an early work by Anthony van Dyck. The last three talks today are from three conservators from three different institutions, one of which is the Smithsonian, one of which is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then there's the Worcester Art Museum. So I expect of these three you might need a little bit of an introduction to one of them. So the Worcester Art Museum. Worcester Art Museum is about an hour's drive west of Boston, and it's a classic American art museum founded right around the turn of the last century. The museum collection is really encyclopedic in nature, and although it doesn't have the numbers of the Smithsonian by any means, it's got well over 35,000 objects in its collection, representing everything from painting, sculpture, decorative arts, photography, prints, drawings, and more, and ranging from ancient to modern. On the left, you see the facade of the 1930s building, and on the right, you see a view of our beloved Renaissance court with its centerpiece, the famous Worcester Hunt mosaic, which is the largest ancient mosaic in North America. So the Worcester Art Museum has a history in conservation that's one that we can be proud of. And it's thanks in large part to these two gentlemen that you see here. The conservators in the room will probably recognize George Stout, who's pictured on the left. They probably don't know that he was the director of the Worcester Art Museum starting in 1947. He was very instrumental in bringing out a gentleman you see on the right. His name is Edmund de Beaumont. And you see him working with some state-of-the-art X-ray equipment from the 1940s. Edmund, I really want to give him props in this talk today because so much of what we're talking about is documentation. And for all the opportunities I might have to differ in opinion in terms of the conservation treatments that took place during his tenure, Edmund was an incredible documenter. He left an incredible record of all the things that he did, and the value to us today is really hard to underestimate. Today, the Conservation Lab remains a vibrant part of the museum's mission to preserve, collect, and exhibit works. There are two labs to the museum. Pictured here is the main lab that houses our Objects Conservation Center and the Paintings Conservation. On the far left, you see the head of the department, Chief Conservator Rita Albertson, and then myself, and then on the right, far right, is Birgit Strela, our assistant paintings conservator. Winifred Murray is shown at the microscope standing. She was one of two Andrew Mellon Fellows that we have. We have these rotating positions of fellowships, and they're typically a 3-year position, and they rotate between specialties of paintings objects and paper. And then in the distance, you'll see Paula Artal-Isbrand, who's our objects conservator. The museum has tried to remain true to its proud heritage of conservation. In 2004, I think it was, we got one of the first of 3 grants from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And that enabled us to purchase some scientific instrumentation. That included an FTIR spectrometer, an XRF spectrometer, improvements to our existing polarized light microscope, infrared reflectography, and what was originally, the line item was budgeted for a more high-powered X-ray tube. That was really the interest of Lawrence Becker, some of you might know as the head of the Objects Conservation Department at the Metropolitan. He was, at that time, head of our department at Worcester. Well, when Larry left for the Met, so did the interest for the high-powered X-ray tube, because nobody was really going to be carrying out the project of looking at the bronze sculptures. So we deemed our current LORAD X-ray tube, which is a LORAD 200, as sufficient for our purposes. And I lobbied real heavy to reappropriate that money in the budget for equipment to go towards starting up the museum in what was then kind of a fledgling technology of RTI and PTM. That took a lot of letters and reports to Angelica Rudenstein. Some of you may know her as a previous head of the Mellon's museum department, which correspondence could be a very trying thing sometimes with Angelica. But I'm glad to say she became a believer in this technology. And then I went out, and it was a bit of serendipity, but I went to a talk where Tom Malsbender was, and just happened to find myself next to him at the lunch table. And he put me in touch with the team at She, Carla and Mark, and it wasn't long before a fantastic collaboration started up. And we designed in 2007 the RTI fixed light array dome that you see here. By 2008, it was installed and we were up and running with it. And then by 2009, we gave the presentation listed below, Reflectance Transformation Imaging, a new conservation tool for examination and documentation. That was at the 37th annual meeting of AIC that was held in LA that year. So since then, we've had time to integrate it into our own workflow. And what thankfully I don't have to talk about today is the principles behind the method. But what I want to talk about is 2 case studies, really, where it became a really powerful tool in our investigations. The picture here is of Paula Artal-Isbrand, who's our objects conservator. And as the photograph suggests, she has a very keen interest in Greek Attic pottery. Well, she had known about a long-standing debate about the production of Greek Attic pottery, and it launched our own investigations that ultimately led to a presentation at the 2010 MRS Fall Meeting, and the title of that you see here. And thankfully, we've had the opportunity to expand on this research since 2010. Originally, it was based on works from the Worcester Art Museum, but because of this research, the Harvard Art Museums had made accessible to us about 18 other Greek vase shards or vases to stack up against our findings of this original research. Now, some of you probably could give this talk a lot better than I can, but Greek Attic pottery, just in a general overview, represents a period from 600 BCE to 330 BCE, and it's generally divided into 2 major areas, the black figure period and the red figure period. Both of these works are in the Worcester Art Museum's collection, and we were particularly interested in looking at some features on the surface of the red figure vases. So the Stamnos that you see on the right from the Tyszkiewicz painter, which had recently been conserved and asked for loan by the Getty, became really the centerpiece of this original research. So the production of this red figureware, the black figureware, really does represent a milestone in the history of ceramic production. And it wasn't until, I think it was the 1970s or 1980s, when a scholar really rediscovered this technique of how these things were made. And it's really a series of different steps in the firing process under 3 different conditions. The first condition is an oxidation condition. And the decorative paintwork that's applied to this surface, I should say from the beginning, has more of a silica content than the rest of the vessel itself. So in the oxidation stage, both the vessel and the surface decoration turn red. Then the firing conditions are changed to a reduction condition, and both of those surfaces turn black. But at that point, the temperature reached such a high point that the silica in the glazed material becomes vitrified and is no longer really reacting with the oxygen. So then it goes under another condition of reoxidation, and the vessel turns back to red again. And thus we get what we typically know as the red figure vessels. So between the red figure and the black figure vessels, the technique I just described can be used for both of them. And the surface decoration itself, although varied and certainly beautiful in so many different ways, the materials and techniques that they used were actually limited in number. And one technique in particular that we were interested in investigating is how did they achieve what's called the relief lines. And the relief lines are those thin black lines. Do I have a pointer? You see the thin black lines in the garments, and then to describe maybe the collar and the features in the face, the eyes, the nose, the eyebrows. Those are called relief lines. And there's been a long-standing debate about how were those achieved, what method was used to achieve them. And scholars differed on what tools were used. So we wanted to go back, reopen up that debate, and see if we could add any information to what was known based on an investigation into the morphology of the lines. And the 2 techniques that we used, we figured were pretty complementary. I already told you we were up and running with RTI within our lab, but we also had access via some great colleagues over at WPI to the use of a laser scanning confocal microscope. So you're getting pretty familiar with all the pros and cons of RTI today. Laser scanning confocal microscopy, I think although it's more of a quantitative technique, whereas RTI is more of an image-based technique, laser scanning, one of the big limitations certainly for this project is just the setup. You can see we were limited to shards. We're not going to put vessels on that stage, and there's not really any opportunity with that particular instrument that we had access to modify the instrument to accommodate for larger objects. So working with shards was actually a pretty convenient use of the confocal microscope, whereas RTI allowed us to look at whole vessels. So we continued with that, and you've seen some live RTIs today. These are still captures. The one on the right is a still capture where it's really specular enhanced. It's really a map of the surface normals. And these images were so rich and informative, we were picking up on things right away. And again, it's the way that it facilitated comparison, easy comparison. You capture these things, and then you had them on file, you could look at them, go back and forth, no need to go to the objects, and it was all right there on the computer screen. You can see from the surface normal image, I hope you can see, oh, that's not so great. Well, you're all invited to come up here and look at the monitor. The specular enhancement really improved our view of the surface. And even with this lousy image, I think you can see that already the incised lines are jumping out, those initial lines that were made to do the sketch of what the image is going to be. And then you also see that the relief lines live up to their name. There is a three-dimensional property to them. So what were some of the techniques proposed? Well, it was all over the board, from reeds to brushes to single-haired or very few-haired brushes, and even syringes where it was more of an extrusion technique. And this image on the right of a bladder and some sort of delivery nozzle was taken from one of the major scholarly publications on how were the relief lines produced. So the other component of our research, other than looking at things with RTI and laser scanning confocal microscopy, was to do mock-ups for ourselves, investigate the research. Can we reproduce what we're seeing, what we now have a better understanding of through RTI? Can we reproduce it right in the lab with our own instruments or tools? One of the things that RTI was showing right from the beginning was that the relief lines were starting to separate out pretty consistently as two distinct types of lines. There was a ridged line, sort of either a rounded topography to the line, or there was a furrowed line. And some of the straight lines, straight diagonal lines that you see, those are the furrowed lines. If you look closely, you'll see a little trough that runs down the center of that line. Whereas, say, the lines on the snake head and around the eye, or the curved lines to describe the ends of the garment, those are the ridged or domed lines. So we're thinking there's got to be a clue in the fact that there's these two different profiles that we're seeing. So we again, ridged line versus furrowed lines, and went back to our RTIs, did further investigations. The little dots here, that's a separate discussion I'm not going to get into right now, but I want to call your attention to the loops at the top and the way that the specular enhancement with these RTI images really brought out the physical properties that characterize these types of lines. How the ridge itself folded over around the tight curve of the loop. Well, we launched into a series of different mock-ups. Here's one of our setups. The image on the left shows our extrusion instrument. It was basically a tube, but for the nozzle we had used the shaft of a feather, and using basically like a gesso mixture in this case, tried to start reproducing the types of lines that we were seeing on the surface of the Greek vases. The image on the right, those are two different stitched images from our confocal work where we're looking at our mock-ups and not finding out anything great, but I just want to point out that it's pretty irregular, and again and again, no matter how hard we tried, you'd start the line, there would be a heavy deposit right in the beginning. And it was really almost impossible to eliminate that feature. Oh, God. So brushes didn't work. You couldn't get the turnover properties of that. And then we got into these single-haired brushes that had been proposed by a Greek vase scholar, Zaderli, decades before. Here, these are all different brushes that Paula made up. They included horsehair, human hair, cat hair, pig bristles, and she really put it through the paces. And here's a charged brush. Here she's laying the brush down in the manner proposed by Zaderli, And he talked about laying the hair down and then just lifting it up. So it's laid down and then lifted up, and sure enough, we were getting that ridged feature over and over again with that technique. But we couldn't get that technique with, we couldn't get that furrowed line using that same technique. Here's a small bristle that we used to produce the loops, and an analysis of those loops with confocal images really provided some pretty compelling evidence that the features produced with what is a modern reproduction on the left compared well with what we saw in these ancient loops on the right. So what about that furrowed line? Well, we proposed that there's actually a distinction between techniques, the laid line and a pulled line. The pulled line is when you're putting the single hairs down or double hairs and pulling it across that surface, you achieve a trough profile. And here's two different confocal elevation maps. And again, the evidence for the similarities in the profile is really compelling. I'm going to skip through these parts, more metrology stuff. One of the other parts of the investigation was to look at the contour line. And the contour line is that big, thick line, which you wouldn't see without RTI. But right along here, it's a ridge that first described or cut out a larger shape. So we wanted to know what came first, the relief lines of the figure or these contour lines. And then RTI was pretty great at allowing us to zoom into these features and pick up properties that had to do with sequence. You know, you see these relief lines extended into the background, and then you see this contour line, plays the contour line overlapping that. And again, we saw that, enough so that we felt that there was a pretty standard chronology used here. Very gratifying to go down the Mass Pike and go to the Boston MFA and see a shard that's been the study from a lot of Greek vase experts called the Kylix fragment. And there you see a painter using who knows what types of tool to decorate the surface. You know, scribes, brushes, everything's been proposed. But with RTI, it was really nice to see that the ridge there between the instrument held in the hand and the vessel really pretty much describes that of the Linearha, the single-haired brush. So this is going to be lightning speed, but if you'll allow me, the other part of the talk was the use of, geez, I'm rambling. This is an ongoing treatment at the Worcester Art Museum, and it's on loan to us from the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp. You'll see right away that there's something odd about the portrait. It's said to be by early Van Dyck, and it's pretty much agreed by all scholars that it is, but you'll see some pentiment around the collar and around the sleeves, which merited our investigations using infrared reflectography. You start to see even more of the pentiment, the fact that the man originally had one of those tombstone or millstone collars that extended all the way around, and being a slave to fashion, he brought the artist back when the styles changed and changed the collar completely. So in X-ray, it really jumps out. The two vertical bands are strips of canvas that are on the panel joins, but you see that millstone collar, and you can also see plenty of changes around the sleeves. But neither of those techniques brought our attention to something that was noticed in the lab by somebody who was less than 5 feet tall, standing in front of this painting on a sunny day, and noticed a little feature in the surface of this painting. And we looked at it, and yeah, there's something there. There might be an inscription underneath there that was covered over at the time of the changes to the portrait. So we went back to the X-ray right into that detail area, which was in the top left, and there was nothing there in X-ray. We went into IR. There's nothing there in IR. We even did a multispectral approach with false color IR, UV-induced visible fluorescence, false color UV. None of this was showing up. But of course, topography and having RTI in the lab, we were hungry to look at this with RTI. Here again, the detail in visible light. And then in RTI, you can see, this might be an act of faith on your part, but you can see some features in here that suggest an inscription. So meanwhile, this is all being carried out by Matt Cushman, and I suggested to Matt, let's go back, let's look at our live RTI. We could never see the whole inscription in view all at one viewpoint, but because it's interactive, let's move around the lighting, and you can, with confidence, outline those areas which you feel are definitely features. So we went ahead with that, and this is the overlay that he came up with. This represents multiple views or multiple captures taken from the RTI and then compiled as overlays later. So it was great that we could go back to the museum, the lending institution, and say, you know, your painting that you've often wondered what year it was painted, we now have evidence to tell you that it was painted exactly in 1619. Just the final thing is that we did map scanning with XRF, elemental map scanning. Nothing in lead, nothing in mercury, nothing in copper, but this is all subsurface analysis. I wanted to do a full map of that area. It was pretty great to come to iron and have, this is the area just focused on one of the letters, which is shaped as a J. And you'll see that that same letter comes out, not only in iron, but in manganese, which suggests it was done with a iron oxide and umber pigment. So it was pretty great that we could go that far in RTI having facilitated it. So the conclusion, maybe it's coming out like a mantra today, RTI can, in some cases, provide insight where other established methods, such as X-ray, infrared reflectography, cannot, and therefore is a really valuable method in the larger field of technical art history. And here's the people I should thank. Thank you very much for your patience.